Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
I love it. I love it. You know you're in good hands. You know something good is about to happen when Coach Mitch takes off the rings. He takes off the rings. Something good's about to happen. All right, we got to get closer. You got to come down here because otherwise I'm going to come out there. And we got this good stage that I don't want to waste. So we got to bring it in like family. Come on now. We're all part of this. We're all part of this. Come on closer. I'll get lonely over here. I want to thank you all so much. This is amazing. This is amazing. Wow. Okay. So this is amazing for a number of different reasons. And the first is that, when I first started thinking about getting into this race, I went and I talked to a pretty successful politician around here. And he said, don't underestimate how hard it's going to be to get anyone to care about this race. And I really took that to heart. And I started going around and talking to folks and really not knowing whether anyone was going to care at all about the stuff that I was talking about. But, I mean, look around. This is 6 months out from a primary election for a judicial race. And look around. There's a lot of folks. There's a lot of folks in the room, right? There's a lot of people who care about our courts, who care about justice. That's amazing. That's amazing. That's not to be taken lightly. I think people sometimes get confused. They think, well, people don't pay attention to judicial races because they don't care about justice. Or people don't pay attention to judicial races because they don't care about courts. I can tell you from experience, from walking the county, that is not the case. People care about this stuff a lot. The difference is they haven't heard people talking about solutions. They haven't heard people talking about the experiences that they had or their families had. We're changing that. And look around. People are here. People are showing up. People care. That's a big deal. That's amazing. It's not just because people care that people are here, though. We had amazing help. There's an incredible group of hosts here that I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart. So if you're a host, can you raise your hand? This host committee is unbelievable. This doesn't happen on its own. A lot of people went to bat. We got a lot of people in our corner, and I just want to thank you all so much. I hope you all know, all I can say is thank you, but I just truly hope you know how much it means to me. This is incredible. So thank you all. Thank you to the hosts. Thank you to Coach Mitch. Thank you to Devon. If someone doesn't sign right, it's not your fault, it's mine. So we got it down. All right, so why do people care about this race? Well, it's for a number of different reasons. One, because justice matters a lot, right? But it's also a unique race. It's a unique race because this office is unique. A lot of people think about judges and they think they stand back and decide cases. And that's true, that's what they do. But what the Illinois Supreme Court can do is much, much bigger because it writes all the rules of procedure, all the rules of evidence, all the rules of ethics for our courts. It determines things like design standards that have access or that impact access to justice for undocumented people and people with disabilities and trans people and people with caretaker responsibilities and people with jobs. It has a role to play in the data infrastructure of the court. It has a role to play in who gets to be a lawyer and how. It has a role to play in attorney discipline and on and on and on. The Illinois Supreme Court is like the computer programmer that writes all the code for the computer that no one really pays attention to very much unless something goes wrong. But it dictates your experience with it, right? It dictates whether it works right, whether it does the thing that you want it to do. That's what the Illinois Supreme Court does. And that's what makes it unique, and that's what makes it really important. Okay, so what is the court supposed to do? What's the program that we're trying to run? There's a British diplomat named Benjamin Disraeli, and he said it pretty succinctly. He said, justice is truth in action. Justice is truth in action, in experience. Not something written in a textbook that we leave behind, but how it interacts with us as people in our lives, right? It's truth in action. And that's really important because the thing that it's really trying to do is to make justice real. That's what our courts are supposed to be about. Truth in action, making justice real, making it so that when we go into a court, we don't have to worry about, am I going to get a fair shake? It has to be real. The Illinois Supreme Court has that power. It's a policy-making body. It has the power to prevent injustices that are happening to people in our community, to us, to our family members. It has that power, right? But it's silent. We know right now that there are people in our community who have been deemed safe to return to the community, who are presumed innocent, who linger in jail for years because they don't have enough cash to pay bail. And on this, our court is silent. We know that our appellate and Supreme Courts are vulnerable to conflicts of interest and judicial corruption. But on this, they remain silent. We know that our system is vulnerable to racist jury selection and biased sentencing. And on this too, our court remains silent. We don't have the moral right to remain silent on these issues. We don't have the moral right to remain silent. We might have the legal right. We don't have the moral right to do it. Okay? So I want to make sure that we're in this together. I said I wanted to bring it in. I want to bring it in even closer. And I want to get a little interactive because I want to affirm our goal, and I want to make sure that everybody knows that if you're in this room right now, you're part of something important. You're part of something special that's building, and that we're in it together. So I want to affirm our goal. We wrote it in big letters. We're here to make justice real. Not something in a textbook, not a promise unkept, not an empty edifice, real justice that we experience. So when I say it, I want you to say it back so that I know that you're in it with me, and I need you to be in it with me. So when I say make justice real, I need you to say it back. Make justice real.
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 That's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do. Okay? And to understand how we do that, it's important to kind of get a basis. And to do that, we're going to travel back in time and halfway around the globe. We're going to go to 1943, to British India, to what was then British India, outside of Calcutta. And we're going there because at that time in the world, that place was experiencing one of the worst famines in modern history. 3 million people die in that famine. Okay? But we're in a kitchen, and we're looking at a large jar that's overflowing with rice. And there's a child standing there, and he's holding a little cigarette tin. And he's from a lower middle class family, and he takes the cigarette tin, and he dips it in the jar, and he fills it with rice. And he walks to the front of the house, and he hands it to a man who's poor and who's starving to death. And he hands over the cigarette tin of rice. And that simple act sparks a question in his mind that changes the world. It rattles around and rattles around in his mind as he grows up. And the answer to that question, he ultimately comes up with the answer to that question, and the answer wins him the Nobel Prize in economics. He's an individual named Amartya Sen. And the question is this: if we're living in this terrible famine, if there's not enough food to go around, then how is it that my family has enough food that I can give it away, but this other family is literally starving to death? And it's kind of a question that maybe only a child could ask. Maybe a question that only an adult could answer, but it's a question that maybe only a child could ask. And the answer is really interesting because for most of human history, we believed famines occurred essentially at random and that they were failures of supply. There's not enough food to go around, and so people starve. So a flood hits and the crops drown and there's not enough food to go around, and so people starve and die. or a drought hits and there's not enough food to go around and people starve and die, or a fire burns the crops and they die and there's not enough food to go around and so people starve and die. That's the prevailing wisdom for most of human history. But what Amartya Sen does is he looks at the data and he looks at famines throughout time and history, and he finds that in every single case he looks at, it's not that there's not enough food to go around. In fact, in some cases, countries are exporting food even as their own people are starving. These aren't failures of supply, they're failures of distribution. A critical bridge washes out and the food can't get to those who value it the most. A corrupt official gets in the way and hoards food so that it can't get to those who need it the most. Or as was the case in the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, colonialist British investment in the war effort at the time sparked hyperinflation that made it so that poor wage earners couldn't afford fundamental things like food. These are distributional failures, and they're not random either, by the way. It's not like some kind of act of God happens and just at random people are chosen to starve. Every single time it hits the people in the lowest rungs of society, the most marginalized people, every single time. And usually it's actually, we see them as these giant events, but usually it only hits about the bottom 5 to 10% of a society. Irish potato famine was particularly bad. It hit about 10%. Usually it's closer to 5. Right? They're not random, and they're not failures of supply. They're failures of distribution. And when you move from an understanding of some tragedy being random to not being random, that changes the way you think about it, right? Because all of a sudden it seems like something that maybe you can fix, right? And that's what happened here. He made the second discovery. He says he finds out that famines actually don't happen in countries with two things. And it's not like a solid agricultural plan or anything like that. It's interesting. A free press and a self-governing democracy. Famines don't happen in countries that have those two things. Because when countrymen begin to starve, the press reports on it. And starving countrymen on front pages of newspapers are really bad for democratic leaders. People begin to march, they begin to write letters, they begin to protest, they begin to vote. True. And when people begin to vote, democratic leaders begin to listen. And so the free press serves as a mechanism to let people know about a tragedy. And democracy serves as a mechanism to make it so that the powerful have an incentive to help the weak. In order to stay in power, they need to rebuild the bridge. They need to remove the corrupt official. They need to stem hyperinflation, right? That's how it works, okay? And now with that understanding, I have to be the bearer of bad news, which is that even though we live in a society with a free press and a democracy, we're suffering from a famine. Not a famine of food, a famine of justice. It's not getting to the people who need it the most. And it's not because we don't have enough resources. These are distributional failures. All right, so we're ready to come back to Illinois, to come back to a court, to come back to close to modern time. Because I don't want to kind of paint this in the abstract. I want to show you how it happens. And I'll show you talking about a case that I experienced. I just finished this a case in the Supreme Court of the United States where we had helped earn the release of a man who was found guilty just based on a judge's whim. No evidence. Just judge kind of made it up. Guy spent 17 years in prison before we could get him released. And I come back to Cook County to defend an individual accused of attempt murder. And DNA is at issue. And my job is to learn everything I can about DNA and to mount his defense. So I read everything I can get my hands on, and we hire a forensic scientist to help us understand the analysis, and I interview the state's DNA analyst. And what we discover is terrifying. What we discover is that the state is using a faulty DNA machine. Okay? You know, if you watch Law and Order, they're like, scrape that blood up off the pavement, throw it in the machine, it's going to pop out the magic answer, right? Not so simple in real life. You need to calibrate those machines, and if you don't, you can get false positives and false negatives. And that's what was going on here. But look, I was optimistic. I thought, we're going to go to trial. I'll put that DNA analyst on the witness stand. We'll cross-examine him. We'll expose this information. We'll make the world a better place one case at a time, right? They'll have to retrain the DNA analyst. They'll have to fix the machine. We'll make the world a better place one case at a time. That's why I became a lawyer, right? That's how it's supposed to work. And I do a little bit more research, and what I find out is that in Illinois, our forensic labs get extra funding when they produce an analysis in a case that ends in conviction. And I do a little bit more research, and I find out that in Illinois, courts get extra funding when they convict. Okay. Entities that we rely on to be impartial. Financial rewards not for finding truth, but for finding guilt. And that offended me, and still offends me. But I was still optimistic because I thought, you know what, we're going to go to trial, and we'll try and expose that information too. We'll make the world a better place. When people know about that, then they'll fix it, right? That's how it's supposed to work. But that's not how it worked. Because what actually ended up happening was we went to judges' chambers under something called Illinois Supreme Court Rule 402. And in a 402 conference, you kind of preview the case. You go back into judges' chambers, and the state says, Judge, this is what we're going to show at trial. And then we say, Judge, this is what we're going to show at trial. And then the judge says, okay, well, based on what you've told me, I think were I to convict, an appropriate sentence would be 70-something years. And then you walk out into the hall, and the prosecutor pulls you to the side and says, all right, you heard the man, 70-something years. But if you plead guilty, I'll ask for 20-something. And so our guy has to decide, am I going to assert my constitutional right to a trial and fight this and risk dying in jail? Or do I take the plea? And he takes the plea. And what that means is I don't get to put the DNA analyst on the witness stand. I don't get to expose the bad machine. I don't get to talk about those systemic funding issues. That information just disappears. And in Illinois, 97.5% of all felony convictions end in guilty pleas. That's a lot of disappearing information. But it solves a puzzle for me, which is this. How does John Burge get away with it for 20 years? John Burge, the Chicago police commander who electrocuted people and tortured people and elicited false confessions. I understand how someone can do a bad thing once or twice and get away with it, but how does an officer of the law get away with that for 20 years? Just functionally, how does it work? And this is how it works. Because you can't expose patterns of misconduct if nothing makes the record. Right? And we have tools that we could be using to protect ourselves from this. One is trials, right? We don't do them anymore, really. About 1 in 40. But even short of that, trials, people say, trials are really expensive. We don't have the resources to do this. All right, fine. Even short of that, depositions. Right? Depositions are a tool to get sworn testimony on the record without using any court resources. We do them in civil cases when money is on the line. We don't do them in criminal cases when liberty is on the line. That's a distributional failure. As Amartya Sen would call it, this is a class-based disaster, right? Because it's a different group of people who uses our civil courts and our criminal courts. Different customer set, right? It's a class-based disaster. This is a famine, right? And the reason that this famine persists, even though we have a free press, is you can't report on what you can't see, and nothing makes the record. It takes a very long time, right? It's a famine. It's that serious. That's why this stuff is happening. It's not random. But what that also means is, if it's not random, we can fix it. Right? This is how it works. So I don't want to, I don't want to just leave you with that anecdote. What I want to do is put it in context. So we're going to travel again. And we're going to go even farther back. Way back. We're going to stay in the United States. Actually, it's not the United States, because we're going back to 1690, before it's the United States. We're going to 1690 Salem, Massachusetts. Does anybody know what was going on in Salem, Massachusetts in 1690?
Witch trials.
Salem witch trials, yeah. That's about as bad a justice system as you can possibly imagine, right? They're taking people, they're accusing them of being a witch, they're putting them on trial, and they're executing them. Hard to imagine a much worse justice system, right? Two big differences between their system and ours. One, the witches actually got trials. And two, the Salem witch trials lasted a total of 15 months before people who were watching those trials said, you know what, I think we're doing something really bad. I think maybe we shouldn't do them anymore. Big difference, right? Our problems are decades old, if not more, and we haven't put the processes in place to bring them to an end. Big difference. They do it in public in courtrooms. We do it in hallways. That's the big difference, right? Now, you might be saying there's another difference, which is, they believed in witchcraft, right? That's kind of burying the, kind of ignoring the most important thing, right? They were ridiculous, right? They believed in witchcraft, right? I'm sorry to say, not that different from how we do things here. Right? Because the thing that they were actually doing, one of the reasons that the Salem witch trials were able to occur was that was actually a bad rule of evidence. They allowed something called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was where someone would take the witness stand and they would testify that they had a vision or a dream. And in that vision or dream, the accused appeared as a witch and hurt them. And based on that, clearly they're a witch, right? That's just the pseudoscience of their time. We do the same thing. We just call it bite mark analysis. We just call it hair follicle comparison. Things that are wholly unreliable. Things that the FBI abandoned, but things that put people behind bars for years and years and years. Things that still have people behind bars. Right? We're not that different from them. Bite mark analysis, bite mark comparison, it's a practice by which you look at a mark on a victim usually, and you try and determine whose teeth made them, right? So they'll get a body with a mark at the Cook County Medical Examiner, and they'll say, okay, well that looks like maybe it was made by teeth. Let's get the forensic odontologist out here. Forensic odontologist is a fancy sciencey way of saying dentist. And they come in and they say, okay, well based on my very scientific opinion, I'm going to take molds and images of the suspect's teeth and compare them to the mark on the body, and based on that I can tell you that they're consistent, and therefore, you know the rest, right? Only now are we doing research on this stuff, and we're finding out that in best case scenarios, those guys are accurate about 2% of the time. Right? Nevertheless, they've been allowed to testify in our courts for a very long time. It's because of Illinois Rule of Evidence 702, our expert admission standard, which says you qualify as an expert so long as you use a technique that's, quote, generally accepted in your field. Okay? Which doesn't seem so bad, but tarot card readers use techniques that are generally accepted in their field, right? But they're not reliable. In federal court, you need to prove that the technique you're using is reliable. That's a better question, right? We can protect ourselves from that. We can copy and paste their rule into ours and protect ourselves from these situations, but we haven't done it yet, right? Our courts have been silent on that, right? And, interestingly, the Salem witch trials come to an end when a man of the cloth named Increase Merchant, who's been watching those trials, ends up writing a really influential paper where he says, look, I've been watching, and I think we might have a problem. It's possible that these witnesses are right, that the accused is actually a witch. But it's also possible that the devil is playing tricks on them, and in fact, the accused is not a witch. That actually it's just the witness having an error, right? That's his 1690s way of saying false positives and false negatives, right? Same thing we were experiencing with the DNA machine, same thing we experienced with bite mark and hair follicle. Same thing. We're not that different. We can be. We can protect ourselves, but we're not that different right now, okay? And this is important. It's important to me in particular, because I represented people who were hurt by this stuff, right? I talk a lot about ideas and rules, but since we're talking about making justice real, we have to anchor it in humanity. And this one's close to me because I represented a guy who was in prison for more than 30 years based on a bite mark scientist who testified against him. And we were doing a post-conviction where we were trying to win his freedom. And those cases take a long time. You show up month after month doing discovery and what have you, and every month we'd have a hearing. And you show up, some of them were just 2-minute hearings, some of them were longer. And every single time, his family shows up. His pastor shows up, his brother drives in from out of town, and his daughter shows up. Every single time. His daughter, who couldn't be much more than 30 years old herself, who probably doesn't have a memory of her father as a free man. And they show up just so that for 2 minutes, when he steps out of lockup into the courtroom, he sees them. And he's reminded that he has a family out there who remembers him, who loves him and misses him, and who's waiting for him to come home. And every single time his daughter asks me, is this the time Dad gets to come home? And every time I have to be the one who says, not yet. And we had a hearing one time. She worked nights, and the hearings were usually in the morning, and they'd come, and she was usually pretty, even though she had just finished a long shift, she was usually pretty bright and bubbly, and she just looked tired and stressed. And she shows up, and she asks the same question. She says, is this the time that Dad gets to come home? And I say, not yet again. But she seems stressed, and I ask her, what's wrong? Are you okay? And she says, no. She said her daughter just died. Her daughter was born and lived and died while her father stayed in prison. He didn't get to hold his granddaughter one time. And I realized at that point, every time she asks, is this the time Dad gets to come home? And I have to say, not yet. That's what she's picturing, right? That first time that her dad is going to get to hold his granddaughter. And he didn't get that chance, right? This is real stuff. These aren't just ideas, right? So when I go and talk to folks and they say, well, why don't you wait your turn? Why don't you run for circuit court first and then appellate court and pay your dues? I don't think they see the customers of the court. I don't think they see the people that I see and have to tell not yet to. I don't think that's the case. I don't think they share our sense of urgency. That bothers me, right? This is real life. It's not real justice, but it's real life. These aren't just ideas. And I want you to understand that. I hope you do. If you're in this room, I think you do. But these are real people. Okay? And it's important to understand that the way we can change it is through the Illinois Supreme Court. Circuit court can't do it. Appellate court can't do it. Governor can't do it. Legislature can't do it. They've tried. They've tried to make some of these fixes, and they get rebuffed. Legislature tried to make some of these fixes, and they get rebuffed as breaching separation of powers. Right? So, for example, in Illinois, when a judge convicts and sentences, they don't have to explain the reason behind the sentence. They just say, guilty, 25 years, next case. Right? Big problem, because sentencing is an error-prone process. And if you make a mistake and don't show your work, like every good math teacher always told you to do, on appeal, you can't point to the error. There's nothing to point to. So you can't fix mistakes. Legislature, in its wisdom, said, all right, let's pass a law saying, if you sentence someone to a felony, you got to explain the reason why. It doesn't have to be long. Just say it on the record. Write it on the record. And the Illinois Supreme Court said, no. You don't get to fix this. Only we get to fix this. And then they didn't fix this. And so it's still this way. Right? They seized authority and abandoned responsibility. We don't have the moral right to remain silent on this stuff. We can fix it. And this is real life, so we have to. It's not acceptable for candidates to come up and say, hey, I'm super fair. I'm so fair. And look how many opinions I've written. And look how many years I've been doing it for. And then just say, please give me your vote. Tell us what you're going to do. Make justice real. Okay? That's where we need to go. That's where we need to go. It's the Illinois Supreme Court, because they're the only ones who can fix this stuff. But I have to tell you, not everybody wants to fix it. Some won't even acknowledge that it needs fixing. I was just at an event the other day, actually, in Wilmette, and I was talking to a group, and I told them the same story that I told you about the DNA machine, right? And the courts getting compensated for convictions. Same story. And another candidate went on after me, and they said, you can't go around telling people how the justice system is broken. People will stop trusting it. Right? That's not how you fix a famine. And I'm not saying it hypothetically. It's been tried, right? Actually, that's how the Brits tried to fix the Bengal famine of 1943. The first thing they did was deny it. They're like, there's no famine. Look over here. We can't deny our way to the fix. And I know that we can fix it, and we've done it before, right? Not that long ago. We actually have great examples of it right here in Cook County. We went through something called Operation Greylord here. Operation Greylord was a massive federal investigation and prosecution that exposed that judges were taking money to dictate outcomes in our courts, right? And the person who, we put judges behind bars because of this, right? We arrested, indicted, and put judges behind bars based on them taking bribes. The person who made that happen, probably the person who was most responsible, the person without whom it really couldn't have happened, was a guy named Terry Hake. And Terry Hake was a young attorney with even less years of experience than I, who joined the Cook County State's Attorney and started taking cases. And he was handling cases and losing cases that he realized there's no reason for him to lose. And what other attorneys there were telling him was, well, someone paid the judge, right? Everyone knows it. Like that's just how it works. You just got to work around it, right? That's just how it was for years and years and years. It's crazy to think, but that's how it was, right? And he wasn't the only one who knew about it, obviously, right? He was surrounded by people with decades of experience, but he was the one who did something about it. And he stood up, and he joined with the feds, and he helped make this investigation and this prosecution possible. And we're all to the better for it, right? Our courts are way better than they used to be. They're still not all the way there. We still have a way to go. But this young guy who just had an amazing moral compass and who was willing to go to bat and not willing to tolerate the corruption stood up and made a difference. We need that now. We need that same thing now. And we can. I don't want to leave you all with this sense that we're condemned to this fate. And I'm inspired by Terry Hake. I'm also inspired by this other thing that doesn't have anything to do with courts. It's an art of Japanese bowl making. And it's called kintsugi. And you take these ceramic bowls that have been broken, and they break along these long lines. And there's multiple things that you can do with a broken ceramic bowl. One is you can get rid of it, right? The other is you can use it and not admit that it's broken and cut yourself, right? Or you can mend it. And there's multiple ways to mend it. And one of the ways you can mend it is by taking clear glue and putting it back together and making it look like it was never broken at all. But that's not what kintsugi artists do. What they do is they put it back together and they mend it with precious metals so that the cracks are literally illuminated, so that the breakage becomes part of the history of the object and the repair becomes the most beautiful thing about it. We can make the repair of this system the most beautiful thing about it. We're not condemned to this fate. We don't have to pretend that it's not broken. We'll cut ourselves. Let's repair it. Let's make the repair the most beautiful thing about it. We can do that. We can get kintsugi justice, real justice, right? We can do that. So I'll say, one last thing, which is that we got a good group in this room, but you are not alone. Bobby and I have been out on the trail, and something's building, something's brewing. Something special's happening. I can feel it. When I first started doing this, it didn't feel like that at all. But now it's starting to feel like that. People are pulling us to the side saying, oh, you're the guy who wants to reform the rules. I say, oh, do I know you? I say, no. I say, my brother told me about you. I say, oh, do I know your brother? They say, no. Something's building. Something's happening. And it's happening because when I talk to regular folks, they say, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, right? That happened to my client, that thing you're talking about. That happened to my family member, right? That happened to me. Say, I'll vote for you. I'll support you. And then I talk to political insiders, and you know what they say? They say, wow, that's really smart. You know what you should do? Don't run for office. Write a book. They say, wow, what you're saying is really important. You know what you should do? Start a youth group. Or they say, what makes you think we would ever support you? Stand in line. Right? So to those folks, I actually don't have anything to say to political insiders. I have to talk to the people who I represented and to the people in our community. To the man whose case we took to the Supreme Court of the United States to get his freedom because the Illinois Supreme Court wouldn't even hear his plea. We're not writing a book. To the people who won't set foot in our state's civil courts because they're afraid that immigration will be there to detain and deport them, we're not starting a youth group or having a bake sale. And to the people who linger in our prisons to this day based on racist pseudoscience, we're not waiting 30 years or 20 years or 10 years for change that we need today. We're here to make justice real. We're here to make justice real. Not a promise unkept, not an empty edifice, real justice, truth in action, something that you experience. No more courts getting compensated for convictions. No more people lingering in jail because they don't have cash to afford bail. No more pseudoscientists in our court. Real justice that you actually experience. Make it real. Make it real. Make it real. Make justice real. Make it so real that I can touch it like a cigarette tin of rice. Make it so real that it shines like the cracks in a kintsugi bowl. Make it real. Make justice real. Make justice real. Make it real with me, and if I promise you, if you come along with me in this justice movement, if you join me, I promise you that we can make it work, that we can fix it. I promise you. We can do it. I swear to you we can. And not only that, but we can make the repair the most beautiful thing about it. We're not condemned to this fate. We can make justice real from Ward 1 to Ward 50, from Bloom to Barrington, from Rockford to Cairo. We can make it real. My name is Daniel Epstein, and I'm running to make justice real.